There we are. Excellent. So if you are already at Vittorio and Brian's talk this morning, you are already pretty familiar with a lot of what I'm going to say here. This was something that we've been, Microsoft, sorry, has implemented already in production, but would like to kind of turn it into something more general purpose so that its benefits can reach everybody. In particular, we feel that this is something that the CAEP standards that are coming out soon will benefit from. And so that is what we designed this with, an eye towards sort of additional use cases in the future. So as you're aware, there's the claims parameter, the claims request in OIDC. The RP can request these new claims if needed. There are many issues with this, as you heard Brian talk about this morning. This is fairly miserable to use, especially if you want to try and understand it yourself up front. But it is handy because it is a structured envelope for saying not only what claims do I need, but also occasionally here are the valid uses or the valid values of those claims. And those are all very nice things to be able to request. So the ways that we use this already, in the spec itself, you see, hey, I need a new fresh ID token. Hey, I want them to perform MFA. And internally, or not internally, but proprietarily at Microsoft, we use it to say, I need these policies to be enforced on the next time you give me a token, because some kind of authorization or authentication policy that the IDP needs to enforce wasn't enforced yet. Please go do that. But yeah, we can't do that for a resource server. Whenever you send your token off, your access token off to an API, we don't have a structured, agreed upon means of saying, I need you to do something else at the IDP before I can let you through. There's a bunch of reasons that we would like this to be expanded beyond just MFA and auth time or max age. One is CAEP, right? So these long-lived tokens that are not dependent upon an introspection endpoint to tell you, hey, this token is no longer valid, is coming onto the scene. And with CAEP, it is possible for the RS to receive a notification that says, don't accept any more tokens from this session ID because it's been revoked. You need to reject this token and have the user revalidate who they are, or perhaps just quickly check to make sure that it's actually revoked or not. As we've seen earlier, MFA requirements. And sorry, let me make sure I can actually see the chat real fast. Can't. Sorry, if you're in chat, please also shout. MFA requirements, so enforce ACR, AMRs, anything that says I need a better standard of proof for who you are before I'll let you access this API. And finally, these are some longer term items, but things like looking up what group somebody is in. Today, a common pattern is dump all of the users' groups into the token and then let the API sort it out. That's both bulky and a little bit not quite so privacy preserving. So if there was a way to say, go back to the IDP and bring me back a token with just this group inside of it, it offers up some nice things here. And of course, finally, there is the idea of enforcing policies that only the IDP can enforce during another set of dynamic authentication. This idea has actually come up before. IETF 106, about 2 years ago, Travis Spencer proposed this, and it didn't quite land. Very similar ideas to what is being proposed here. And so I think right now we're basically saying, hey, with CAEP and other features coming onto the scene, is there time for a second look at this? Now, I do want to call out here, while I have chosen the claims parameter as a way of expressing this envelope of requirements the resource server needs to send back. I'm not at all attached to it, especially after listening to Brian this morning. And so really it's a matter of using this time for discussion and understanding how else do you see this working? What else do you think could be a quality way of building this? So just as a quick refresher, my slideware is not as nice as Vittorio's. An access token is sent up to the resource server. That resource server receives some event saying, hey, that session has been revoked, no longer accept those tokens, or do something special with them. That claims challenge is sent back. And in this case, we're proposing at a rough level, a basic C4 encoded claims request effectively with the insufficient claims error as opposed to the one proposed this morning, their words. And then finally, a claims request that is just the decoded value here, and then URL encoded is sent back to the authorization server, along with the refresh token at first, and then perhaps interactively to get that access token back. That's about it. The one key thing here to call out is that we are adding this access token as a target inside of the claims field. I'd love to learn why that was designated so out of scope beyond just opaque blobs as access tokens in the original spec. So yeah, there are some open questions here really quickly. We've got some open questions around like, is it okay to just give this to the client? I mean, it makes sense if things are stateless, but and this came up a little bit earlier today as well. You know, the more stuff we entrust to this envelope, the less it seems like a great idea to pass it all through the client. So maybe there's a way to just bypass the client entirely. That would require usually adding state to the IDP though, and not everybody supports that. Could we do something here beyond just, you know, adding access token as a field here? This seems very limited. So taking the opposite tact of Vittorio and Brian this morning, instead of making this a small change that's kind of the tedious bit necessary, are there other problems that this could also solve or that we could just move to beyond this? And of course, the problem that we're solving right now is no community input. And so we'd love to talk to people and understand how to better expand on this. So yeah, let's do that. I'm gonna actually stop sharing and focus on discussion. Vittorio, Brian. Brian in particular, I'd love to hear from you about some of your other challenges with the claims request and why it was you kind of called out this morning like it's yeah, he's the one who said it. Sorry, Vittorio. Well, it's not on screen right now, so you know, yeah. Why it was considered out of scope in the original OIDC spec?
Well, so it wasn't considered out of scope. It was
or scoped out, rather. Yeah.
Yeah, scoped out. Well, it was in there, but a lot of contributors to the standard didn't care for it. I can't speak to all of them, but I think probably for similar reasons that I had, and so it was made optional with this metadata field to indicate whether you had support after much to do and back and forth about it. So it's there, but the pushback originally was what caused it to be sort of just an optional piece. I don't have much more justification for that than the history there, but there were very significant contributors that didn't care for it. And largely around a lot of the things I said, just difficulty in implementation, complexity, the various, it's sort of just this big bag. I don't know how else to say it. And then just while you got me, the draft from Travis that had sort of the claims access token sync, that was actually presented at the IETF, I think largely in an attempt to get a certain set of product features that were already working, as opposed to the working group looking at RAR. It was really presented as an alternative to RAR to use claims as an authorization thing. And my cynical take on it is, since that was already sort of a certain product already works that way, so it was put forward to try to follow that pattern. It did have something similar to the access token level claims request. I can't remember the exact syntax, but there wasn't anything in the like in the resource challenge for it. It was about the client itself trying to figure out what claims to request for for whatever particular resource it was trying to access.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I feel like I'm just sort of munging words here, but I think it's a matter of how kitchen sinky one imagines this thing to be, and some preferences in terms of, specific, simple, and general catch-all, maybe at the cost of complexity.
Yeah. One thing that I'm trying to fit into the proposal from this morning is we have certainly one additional claim or message that we want to route from the resource server back to the IDP, which is go enforce this specific policy ID. It seems somewhat inevitable that we have to teach our specific clients how to do that and have people add custom extensions to their application to go handle that. And that's one of the things we'd love to avoid here. And that's why we want to make it general purpose. Is that sort of just a accepted cost, do you think, that we should accept?
Frankly, I'm not convinced. Let's say that for one parameter, which is proprietary at this point, because the concept of policy, we have an intuitive idea of what there is, but if you take 3 different services, you'll have 3 different interpretations of what's in there. So unless it's a concept which is defined somewhere else, and then you say, let's transport it, then I don't know if it belongs to something which is designed to make different roles communicate.
No, that's exactly it.
But on top of all of these, I'd like to just make a couple of comments on the things that you described so far. I agree that CAEP is very important and it's coming, but it seems a bit odd to take an event-based architecture and plaster it in this particular case. Because basically, if you were to have an event that goes to the resource server, now you still need the resource server to wait until the next call from the client to then piggyback on that particular call and send back, which is stateful, and it's also not very event-oriented. Like, this thing might not happen for a long time, and so now you might be unable to really enforce this. So for me, the event is not necessary for this particular scenario to come together. Let's say that the resource server will decide in whatever way it wants to decide why it's no longer happy with tokens that come before. Whether it's event, whether it's on, doesn't matter. If instead I step out of that particular scenario and I think about, okay, events are coming, to me, these points more to, I need an event sync or equivalent in the client, so that if there is something that the client needs to do, I need to be able to tell the client. Instead of plastering these on top of the resource seems complicated. And the other thing that you mentioned about the groups, it's interesting, but it is to me in the domain of claims already. Let's say that if you want to do that, then there are claims, and then there is the discussion about how to actually make these applicable to access tokens as well, which is largely syntax. But to me, this stuff is specific enough that I don't need to bring the entire caravan of OpenID to IETF to implement step-up authentication. Let's say that missing a use case as compelling as max age and authentication that can be added, and actually more than one, in which it can suggest there might be extensibility in the future. To me, updating the code to parse more stuff of an envelope, or updating the code to parse more stuff of a response, it's still updating the code. The fact that when you have an envelope, it doesn't crash, it doesn't matter. I can ignore extra parameters before. So in terms of implementation and in terms of effort, I see the extra expressive power to be an inhibitor of adoption and of interoperability out of the box. And I don't clearly see the advantage. Again, I'm not saying it's not there. I'm saying I think I need to see more concrete scenarios that are more infrastructural rather than assuming that an access token is an ID token. I'm short of breath.
That's good. Thank you. I appreciate it. I see Pieter coming online as well.
Oh no, Pieter is coming online. What am I going to do now?
Run, Vittorio, run.
Back to vacation.
Back to vacation, yeah. So I think as a next step, right, it seems like a logical thing is to present the set of use cases and see what the way I'm hearing you, Vittorio, the thing that you are not object to, but the thing that causes concern is if this turns into something that is so generic that you can't guarantee any interop. Is that an accurate?
I think that already is. Let's say that to me, what you're doing here is taking the claim parameter and making it applicable to this particular scenario. And then you can change slightly the syntax of the envelope and similar, but to me, it is creating machinery for something hypothetical, whereas the stuff that we proposed this morning with Brian is very concrete. Let's say that it is a scenario which people recognize as like, oh yeah, it happens to me. And given that having extensibility without a clear eye on the prize, to me, is an enemy of gaining consensus, of clarifying the exact scenario that we have, of giving recommendation about security, privacy, and similar for that particular scenario, as opposed to propagate everything parametric, because the moment in which you have flexibility, you need to propagate across the entire thing, all those generic considerations, because you don't know what they will be binded to. So to me, just emerged from having fought for one simple spec, not as simple as this one, but simple, to go through all the various consensus and similar. My instinct is to try to keep it as simple as possible and to have a clear return of investment. Like for these, I already know there is a large number of people that I will tell them, here, there's my new SDK that can do this. Here, there's my new API gateway that is capable of doing this. And my authorization server already does OpenID, so I can already do max age and ACR and similar. So basically, all I'm saying is I see the potential behind your argument and behind your approach. But I think that if you wanted to do this for CAEP, then you're not going far enough. I think that you should, if you want to do this for CAEP, then why not going and adding an event sync to the client so that you don't need to rely on piggybacking on the return lag from the resource server to the client when the client calls and the time of its choosing. It's kind of like a half event and half hoping that the client will make a call, which to me seems odd. So I agree, CAEP is a valid scenario. I just think that you're not going far enough if you're trying to do this. And the other scenarios that you mentioned, like the policy and the asking for extra groups and similar, I think they are interesting, but they are just not at the same level of popularity as the other two. So I'm happy to hear more scenarios, but for what I heard so far, I think that my course of action would be to just go ahead and enshrine what I presented this morning with Brian in a draft and just push it as is. And then, just like this thing extends the default set of things in there, I don't see any reason for which you can't have also an insufficient claims in which you actually work with claims if you want to work with claims.
Mm.
Does it help?
Oh, yeah, it's interesting. I'm hearing if it was important enough to add to this, then we would just add it as a third one.
No, but it's the thing is there are two parts. One, you called out, and I really appreciate, thank you for that, a concrete extra parameter, which is the policy. And to me, like, I'd be happy to add it in the list if you would identify it somewhere. It's like, for example, in the JWT AT, I introduced extra claims, which were coming from scheme concepts. Like, I knew that those things were already in people's radar, and I said, okay, here there is a situation in which I may want to transport these. So if you were to look around the panorama of our industry and find something that says, yeah, that's a policy, that is the thing that I want to transport, then we could look at the use case and see if it deserves to be an extra parameter in there. And that's one aspect. The other aspect is generic machinery for asking any claims. And that one is the one where I have a methodological challenge, because I think that it's already there and people aren't using it. And my hypothesis is they aren't using it mostly because it's too broad, it's too generic. And instead, having something specific that satisfies those two particular scenarios, ACR and MaxAge, instead would pay dividends right away. And that's just my position. I don't know what Ryan's position is, but that's my position.
Ryan?
That's hard to follow. Again, I think it's a philosophical difference about sort of incremental, near-term achievable and generalized larger use cases maybe being future supported. I think Hirsch, you say that there's basically one claim you want to smuggle through all this, which I didn't fully understand, but it's a lot of baggage to carry around, and I guess seek consensus for, and then hope that implementers pick up. There's multiple stages for this, and Vittorio touched on the consensus building and the specification part of it, but even after that, there's the reality of deployment and implementation. That the world is littered with standards that didn't get implemented, and so that's a consideration as well. And I think sometimes overly generic, overly broad things are more prone to fall to that fate.
Yeah, absolutely, I hear you. Yeah, I think it's interesting you call it philosophical, like, because my concern is whenever I see adding two very specific parameters there, our saying is usually, there's 0, 1, and n, right? Like, you hit 2. Why do you assume it'll end at 2? So we do have 3-ish values already that we want to pass through. So one would be IP address, right? For IP-based restrictions, if there's awareness of the resource of that information. We've got, like I mentioned, the policies, and then just other versions of MaxAge, like auth2 or IAT, right? Vittorio knows exactly why this is. So, it's
the IP one, like.
Yeah, what I guess I don't.
For things occurring at arm's length.
Vittorio, tell me about, like, what was it about the IP address that freaked you out?
So on one side, I can't say anything because I remember discussions when I was still wearing the same colors as you, and I don't know how much of that is kosher. So I will not touch on that. But like, I think that to me, IP often falls into the category of I'm trying to reproduce anomaly detection, and I don't have a context, so I trust the client to attach the context, and it's kind of like, really, you can pretty much like pretend whatever you want to be. Like, if you want to send that kind of information, it needs to be sent in a bit more trustworthy way. I don't even know if it's possible. But my meta challenge with this is, I know that you guys already implemented this, and I know that for everything you have, I assume that you have good reasons for having it. But unless you can generalize those reasons, I don't think that you can expect to enshrine in a generic standard everything your implementation is already doing. So in the particular case of IP, like expanding on a scenario, saying why you think is useful, pointing out the cases that others are doing that are not specific to your implementation would help. Otherwise, just having like the list of the things that you are sending without the extra, unless they are self-explanatory, it's just going to be a tough conversation. That's my impression. And based from other efforts I've seen in the past, in which people like either had implementation or they went really far in a proposal and then showed up at ITF saying, here is my proposal, please adopt this very old dog that has issues with kids. Like saying, well, let's think about it. Maybe, do you have a younger dog? I don't know.
So I think, to be clear, right, I think we're not trying to say we implemented something and therefore we want to standardize it. I think what we're saying is we have this pattern that recurs, and I don't think we're hung up on our implementation as such. I don't know, Hirsch, you should stop me if you think that's not necessarily true, right? But I think it's seeing the mechanism that you proposed, and it looks like it's very close to the thing that that would meet a need on our side as well. I think the question is there some of the scenarios that we have in mind that is actually attractive to other people in the world, right? And I also, what I'm hearing is, as we do that, it would be good to see, it would be good for us to see who else would benefit from it and bring that as co-conspirators to this conversation, I think. Right? I'm a little bit translating, Vittorio, but that's what I think I'm doing.
That's great. That's fantastic. Like, I think that's exactly the spirit, as in like, here is a scenario, and that's what we would require to. And so, yeah, that's great. But I think that the angle of the scenario and the angle of like, let's generalize it, is really the right approach for looking at these into generalizing it. Whereas like right now, like either I misread what Hirsch said earlier, saying, well, we already implemented this, so we want to make this available on wider tier, and then I misinterpreted just hearing the three parameters without any extra context about what it is used for, like basically the scenario. But if you go with a scenario, by all means.
Hirsch?
Yeah, absolutely. So this, the reason I brought up that we have implemented it was that it's not coming out of nowhere. It's actually a thing that we found necessary and we built. And yes, we are interested in hearing if anybody else has needed such a thing, right? And your discussion this morning was a good launching point for that. Clearly, there is a need for some amount of this. And what we have seen is that we've needed more than that. And presumably we're not that unique. in that regard. So IP address, right? We have split tunnel scenarios where the resource wants to validate that the user is still coming from the correct IP range, right? Now, the problem here is that the IDP and the resource are seeing different IP addresses. And now all of a sudden, the policy can't be met. So, you don't, obviously, like you said, you don't want the client attesting to the IP address because they'll just tell you what you want to hear. So you have the IDP do it for you and attest to it in a secure way.
But so here you have a client transmitting it, like you have the exact equivalent. Let's say that you are sending back a challenge, and like if it is an individual parameter, then it's the client that takes the thing from the RS and attaches it to the access. So unless you have something that, for example, is signed by the resource so that the client cannot screw with it, then
it doesn't need to be signed.
Still asking the client to basically declare whatever IP they want.
No, the token shows up with the IP that the IDP saw, and either it shows up, the claim shows up in the token, or it doesn't.
So I misunderstood, man. Like you said that you wanted to send back a parameter, just like in analogy to the things that we already have in there. Instead of just sending ACR values, you send the IP value from the RS, correct?
I think.
Go ahead, Brent.
I'm just trying to understand where, like, because like I just assumed these to be another parameters in the list that we added, that the resource server send back to the client, and that the client can transmit back to the authorization server. If you said that the problem you want to solve is the client not declaring whatever they want, if you do this way, you wouldn't solve it because the client can still ignore the stuff that you received from the resource server as part of an error challenge and put whatever they want in there.
Absolutely. So remember, in claims parameters, there is no requirement that you include a specific value. So this is simply saying, oh, I need this claim. I just need the IDP to attest to a certain value. And yeah, you could do that statically, right? You could set up your application registration and say, hey, always give me this value. You could do that for everything though, right? You could just set up a static thing that says, hey, my scope needs this ACR, right? That would be ugly, but you know, or just I'll always require MFA.
Right.
These are things that we want dynamically to occur.
I think that there is these points to the scope creep that I suggested might become a problem, which is the proposal is not to create a generic mechanism for asking anything about what he would receive. Because at that point, you will end up with something that is really like basically what we already have. You already have a claims parameter. And the claims parameter today doesn't seem to have like these huge traction. Here, it was more of like, I was trying to understand these in terms of extra parameters that you would provide as with the same mechanism that we suggested this morning. And then in that mechanism, you actually ask for a specific value, as in you didn't meet this requirement. Whereas if I understood you correctly right now, here you want a mechanism in which you say, I want this other claim in the token. And normally in your table, you say this client asking for those scopes for this resource would result in those claims. You want a dynamic mechanism for determining what's in there. That is definitely the claim parameter, but it's also definitely not what we were trying to achieve this morning.
Yeah, we need both, to be clear. We need the ability to say both. Sometimes it's just we need this claim at all, and sometimes we need it to be one of these specific values.
I think that the difference here, like there are a number of differences that ripple across the board, but is that in that particular case of step-up authentication and similar, there are a number of considerations that, for example, are intrinsically asking for interaction, for example. So from a developer perspective, that is a problem that we normally need to deal with, as in, I need in my code now to wait for a moment in which I can actually prompt I need to call the APIs that will do the prompt and similar. Whereas if you just have a generic mechanism that says, let me ask for claims, you don't necessarily have these interactive requirements. You might just use these as a generic mechanism. So to me, that widens the scope further, and so lowers the applicability of this thing. In terms of value of the guidance, you already get into a more generic scenario in which there are more moving parts and in which the resulting spec needs to have a section about when you can actually achieve these by just using a refresh token and somehow say, use the existing session, give me back something with that particular claim, versus something that is actually requiring to do the pop-up. So that's why I called out the step up in the title, because that's the scenario I'm thinking of. Instead, in this particular case, you just have a generic mechanism for asking dynamically for things about the content of a token. It's also interesting, but it's much wider with way more sub-use cases that can be implemented. So the resulting spec would be much bigger. And sure, it has enough expressive power to also do the step up, but there would be a sub-core of that spec, which is just about the parts in which you need it to be interactive. And frankly, I'm not ready to fight for a generic language for asking for the shape of a token. Also because there are other extra complications, as in like now you needed to introduce what to do for introspection, which is not super clear how it adds if you are doing something different from. So in general, to me, that feels like a much bigger scope if you want to enable something that does not directly impact the session, but it's just a matter of the content of a token.
Yeah, no, I see where you're coming from. Absolutely, Vittorio. And I appreciate it. Yeah, actually, that does raise a question from me about yours, if we can reverse the order of these meetings. Does yours actually require a interactive auth every single time?
Not every single time, but like when it comes into play, it needs the user to actually hit the authorization endpoint. Then the authorization endpoint might not have to do much. Let's say that you are asking for a step up, and the system browser performed the exact same step up outside of the code of the application. Mm-hmm. So now you are hitting the authorization endpoint, and the authorization endpoint already has a different session which already meets your requirements. And then at that point, you can actually bring stuff back out. But in general, talking about authentication step up, yes, I think that the general assumption would be you are hitting the authorization endpoint. In fact, we also had some discussion with Brian about can we extend these beyond the authorization code flow? And we thought like a device grant and similar, and I said, well, Occam Razor, for the time being, let's stick to the authorization code in which the little diagram that we have shown this morning basically holds.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of our philosophical ideals is that we avoid hitting authorize as much as possible, and that's why we focus so much on putting this in the refresh token, or making this usable with the refresh token as well as by hitting authorize. So because we have mechanisms for saying stop in one place, go to the other. So.
And of course, it makes complete sense because of the goals you have. Given that the goals you have is having a say on the content of a token regardless of the session, it's very natural for you to try to have this power in the refresh token. The thing in the other side is that the step-up authentication in the name itself, it suggests that is the particular case in which, unfortunately, you exhausted other tricks, and now you've got the pop-up.
Maybe maybe calling it philosophical wasn't quite right, but even just intended scope of the goals here. But I got a little caught off by how does what you're doing now or envisioning work with the refresh token, Hirsch?
So I mean, the refresh token being a portable session, effectively. Often a thing that we'll see is that you already fulfill Acker Gold, but you never requested it. So you don't actually have to do anything, right? Your initial authentication fulfilled Acker Gold because, you know, I used my YubiKey to sign in, even though all I needed to do was use a password. And so your session already fulfills Acker Gold. I would like Acker Gold. I'm not going to force you to, you know, open up, do a full page navigation or anything to prove that.
So, I mean, like the actual bits and pieces, logistics of that working, the resource challenges with this claims thing, and then that's presented in conjunction with the refresh token to ask for specific. Okay.
Yeah, and that's actually an expansion, unfortunately, of the original claims parameter as well, I believe, which is only supported on authorized.
Yeah, that's where I got lost there. That okay.
Yeah. No, I know, Vittorio. You don't need to say it.
No, but I'm not gonna say what you think you're saying. I'm saying that we can achieve all of that just with a client code. Let's say that the moment in which you cache the refresh token, if you cache the Acker that was used in the session, like say that you obtain that refresh token and you get back some signal from a authorization server that says the Acker that was used for this is X, like an ID token together with that refresh token. If you place the Acker in your cache, now the next time that you try to call an API, you receive a challenge. And this challenge says Acker value is equal mine. And then you go to your SDK and you say, SDK, go to the authorization server. And this is the ACR I want. If you find that you have a refresh token cached, which has that value, potentially you say, you know what? I already have a refresh token. I'm just going to use it. And I know that if this works, that will be the Acker that will be considered and enshrined in the access token I get back. So it's something that you can do without necessarily extending the parameters to the authorization server. But now you are relying on complex machinery on the client, which, as you know, now that you are in the middle of a ADAL to MSAL migration, is problematic. But technically, you don't need to extend the claims parameter. You can do all these with cache magic.
Yeah, I get very uncomfortable while clients having to specifically understand what in Acker means, particularly if they're not purely hierarchical.
You don't need to understand in Acker. Here, all I'm saying is like doing the pure string comparison. If I receive the challenge from the resource server that says, I need to have an access token that has Acker equal a certain string, and if you go in your cache on the client and you already have a refresh token which already has that Acker, then when you get an access token using that refresh token, you will have the same Acker.
Of course,
as long as
that's a very specific string to go match.
Well, you do the same with scopes. Like today, if you look at what you are normally doing with an SDK, and you say, I need to call this API, and I didn't receive any challenge. I'm saying, I know I'm going to try to call the right method of this API. When you go to your SDK, you say, SDK, I need an access token for that audience, and this is the scope that I need to be guaranteed is in there. And if you have a cache, normally there is a string comparison that will do this. This is not different. The only difference is that you are doing this for the refresh token. And you're already doing this because if you have an access token in your cache, but it's expired, before prompting the user, you'll go look at your refresh token and see if the refresh token is capable of giving you those scopes. This thing about the Acker is the same. The client doesn't need to understand the semantic of the scopes. It doesn't need to understand the semantic of the Acker. I think your challenge is that for you is not Acker, is more complex stuff like policies and similar, which you might have hierarchies, components, and similar. So your client might be required to do more complicated stuff. But if you just do the scenario, of a description that we gave this morning, technically you can do it without any extension to the authorization cell.
So I like what you proposed this morning. I want to be clear about that. But I do disagree. I mean, I don't think you can. The string matching with scopes makes sense because the scopes inherently produce something. But accurate values have generally a hierarchical meaning. Gold is better than silver is better than bronze. But where does nobelium sit in the middle of all of that?
So here the string comparison is not perfect, and in fact here I would say it's like the mechanism that we suggested this morning isn't suggesting that anyone, like that the client understands this. The client just passes it along. So the fact that you might have a different ACR that happens to be considered by the RS as powerful as the one that is requesting, if it's a different string, it's going to be a different string. So you will have a cache miss and you will have to actually present this stuff. But like this is another example of this stuff is just sending strings around. It's not trying to teach the client to get into those strings. In the same way, like the exact same reasoning that you did now, you could do it for scopes. You could have a read and a read-write, and read-write does both. But if you're just doing string comparison, which is what pretty much every SDK that has a cache does, then the read-write will be a miss and you'll have to reprompt the user. So ACR doesn't have any difference in that respect. Whatever relationship between ACR values, you can have exactly the same for scopes.
Yep.
So much work.
We appreciate it though, Vittorio.
Let's go shopping. No, you know it. I had fun.
Yeah. I think that does about cover it though. Pieter, any other questions you'd like to ask?
I think I'm good. I do think the next steps for me still remains, right? Let's get those scenarios, share them. I think it makes sense to think about the ones that are useful to everybody, right? Yeah, let's start the conversation at least. I also wonder, I'd love to actually see more, Vittorio, of the proposal. I probably didn't understand all of it this morning, but it may, it's an interesting question, right? Is there a way to, the hacker in me wants to do things that may not be appropriate, right? Because to what extent, Hirsch, do we need to be able to specify which claims, right? Isn't it enough to just say, get me, is it necessary to communicate the claims itself, or is there a model in which we say something's changed, you need to effectively reauthenticate or get a new token, etc., right? Because I'm just wondering if how much detail we do need to be passed back. But we can take that offline and talk about that.
Yeah, that'll be great. Thanks.
All right. Thank you for calling the session. It was very interesting.
Vittorio, thank you.
Thanks for attending.
Brian, thanks.
Cheers all.